In 2025, the hot winds of the Sahel carried more than the dust of the desert. They carried the sparks of rage. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, crowds poured out in numbers not seen in decades. They came not to demand bread, not merely to complain of rising prices. They came with a singular, defiant message. The age of foreign domination must end. For decades, the shadow of France had loomed over West Africa. Thousands of troops stationed under the banner of counter-terrorism, lucrative mining contracts tilted toward Paris, and a system of dependency that turned Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali into pawns on a global chessboard. But with the rise of a younger generation, with frustration layered over years of neglect, the anger could no longer be contained. Captain IbrahimTraore, the soldier who seized power in Burkina Faso, became the symbol of this defiance. To many of the youth, he was not simply a leader, but the embodiment of sovereignty itself. Day after day, crowds filled the squares. French flags were ripped down, trampled, and burned before the eyes of the world's cameras. Black smoke curled into the sky as chants of "End neocolonialism" echoed across the city. Among the flames, Russian flags rose, not as an invitation to another empire, but as a gesture of resistance. The message was clear. The people no longer wanted Paris, no longer wanted Washington, they wanted themselves. In Niamey, the capital of Niger, the scene repeated. From narrow markets to wide boulevards, demonstrators poured out. Children waved signs, women beat drums, men shouted slogans that shook the air. Tension hung thick. The rage was not only against their own governments, but against the legacy of colonialism and a global order that had treated Africa as a resource depot for far too long. Clashes turned deadly. Ambulance sirens tore through the chants, mingling with cries of grief and shouts of fury. Yet even in the face of bullets, the crowds refused to disperse. One young man screamed into the chaos, "We are not afraid to die. We are afraid to live forever in chains." His words spread online like wildfire, becoming the rallying cry of an entire generation. Analysts in Paris, Washington, and Moscow began watching with alarm. Control was slipping. What once might have been stamped out now burned out of reach. This time was different. This time the protests were not fleeting eruptions. They were fueled by the collective memory of betrayal and the determination of a youth that would no longer bow. Walls across Ouagadougou filled with graffiti. "Sahel belongs to us. No more France. Freedom or nothing." They were not vandalism, but declarations, written in paint and sealed with blood. Soon the political earthquake reached beyond the streets. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso announced new alliances, severing ties with France, sending shockwaves through the African Union and the United Nations. The Sahel had become the epicenter of global tension. Yet through it all, the chants on the streets never stopped. This is our land. This is our future. The fire from the Sahel was no longer a local blaze. It was a symbol of uprising, a spark capable of igniting a continent. But this was only the beginning. In East Africa, a death in the shadows of a jail cell was about to turn into a volcano of rage no one could contain. It began with silence. The silence of a young man whose life was cut short in the custody of the police. His name was Albert Omondi Ojwang, an ordinary Kenyan, unknown beyond his community. But when news spread of his death behind bars, the silence erupted into thunder. For years, Kenyans had endured rising food and fuel prices, the crushing weight of corruption scandals, and a police force feared rather than trusted. Albert's death was the final straw. It was not just one life lost. It was the symbol of all lives abused by a system that had long stopped protecting its people. Nairobi exploded. Crowds filled Moi Avenue, carrying signs painted with Albert's face. Kisumu rose, Mombasa roared. Streets became oceans of anger. The air thickened with chants. "Justice for Albert! Stop police brutality!" The young and the old marched side by side, their voices merging into a tidal wave of fury. Police responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and arrests. But repression only deepened the defiance. Mothers carried portraits of their sons, chanting through tears. Students faced down riot shields, refusing to disperse. And Albert's name, once unknown, became a chant that echoed far beyond Kenya's borders. This was not just a protest over one death. It was a rebellion against poverty, against corruption, against a government that had failed its people. It was a demand for dignity, for bread, for a future, for a... International media turned their cameras toward Kenya, capturing a country at a breaking point. Analysts compared it to Tunisia in 2011, when the death of a street vendor sparked the Arab Spring. Could Albert be Kenya's spark? Could his death ignite an African spring? The answer was uncertain. But in the eyes of those marching, one thing was clear. Kenya would never be the same. Nigeria, Africa's giant, carried its own scars. In 2020, the world had watched the #EndSARS movement unfold. Tens of thousands of young Nigerians rising against a police unit infamous for extortion, torture, and killings. The movement was met with bullets, blood, and broken promises. By 2025, little had changed. Despite government pledges, police brutality continued. When fresh reports of killings emerged, the ghost of #EndSARS rose again. Lagos erupted first, with thousands gathering at Lekki toll gate, the site of a massacre 5 years earlier. They held candles, sang, and raised signs reading, "Never again." Abuja and Ibadan soon followed. Hashtags surged across social media, amplifying the protests to a global audience. Videos of police clashes, live-streamed in real time, drew millions of views. The voices of Nigerian youth reached far beyond their borders, becoming part of a worldwide chorus against injustice. Once again, the government tried to dismiss the protests. Once again, the youth refused to be silenced. The memory of blood spilled in 2020 was still fresh. The demand was not just for reform, it was for accountability, for justice, for a nation that valued its people's lives. EndSARS had become more than a movement. It was a symbol, and in 2025, it returned with a vengeance, showing that the fight for justice in Nigeria was far from over. Burkina Faso, Kenya, Nigeria, 3 nations, 3 different struggles, yet one shared heartbeat. In Ouagadougou, it was sovereignty. In Nairobi, it was dignity. In Lagos, it was justice. Different sparks, but the same fire. Across the continent, youth made up the majority. They were connected by phones, by hashtags, by shared frustration. They were not waiting for leaders to speak. They were speaking for themselves. Social media carried their cries across Africa and into the world, uniting communities from Dakar to Johannesburg. The protests revealed more than anger. They revealed potential. Africa was no longer silent. The young generation was demanding a seat at the table, not as subjects, but as citizens, not as dependents, but as drivers of their own destiny. And in their chants, one could hear not only African struggles, but global echoes. The fight against neo-colonialism in Burkina Faso mirrored struggles in Latin America. The cry against police brutality in Kenya and Nigeria resonated with Black Lives Matter in the United States. Africa's voice was not isolated. It was part of a worldwide demand for justice. The protests of 2025 were not just African events, they were global warnings. The Sahel is critical to energy and security. East Africa is a commercial hub. Nigeria is the beating economic heart of the continent. When their streets burn, the world cannot ignore the flames. For foreign powers, the message was clear. The old ways are collapsing. Control through troops, contracts, and corruption no longer works. The youth of Africa are rising, and their message is unyielding. But beyond geopolitics lies something deeper: humanity. The blood spilled in Ouagadougou, Nairobi, and Lagos was not only tragedy, it was testimony. Testimony that Africa refuses to remain in chains, that Black Lives Matter not just in slogans, but in the streets where people are willing to die for dignity. And so, the world watches as Africa rises, bloodied but unbowed. These are not merely protests. They are the birth cries of a new era, and they speak to us all. Ignore them, and the fire of Africa may one day spread beyond its borders, shaking a global order already on the edge of collapse. Africa rises in 2025. Its people have spoken, and their voice is no longer just for Africa, it is for the world.